Hello, welcome to Talk Wildlife, and today we've got sort of a follow-up video on one that went out a couple of weeks ago from BirdLife Australia, and I did mention it at the time. That particular one was about a species of parrot called the swift parrot, and this one is protected under the same program by BirdLife Australia, and it's the Regent Honeyeater. And I have with me Dean Ingwersen, whose name I've actually pronounced right because he's informed me, which is grand, who's the Woodland Bird Program Manager for BirdLife Australia. Hiya, Dean, how are you doing?
I'm going really well, thanks, Alan, and yourself?
Excellent, thanks, excellent. Right, okay, so we're going to get through this regardless of the fact that you've got two kids behind that door that are probably desperate to bang on the door and say, Dad, we've finished all your beer, can I have another one?
Let's have a go.
Right. Okay, so first of all, I think because, those people that might not have been to Australia might not have come across the group of birds which are the honeyeaters. So can you give me just an overview, not at this point of the Regent, but of the honeyeaters in Australia?
They're a really fascinating group of birds. So they're a group of songbirds. Off the top of my head, there's 70 plus species within Australia itself, and then you get honeyeaters in places like New Guinea and some of the surrounding islands. New Zealand has some representatives, so they're kind of this oceanic Australasian crossover group. They're largely, I guess, evolved to the ecology of the plants of Australia, which, you know, everything evolves to the plants and the habitats that they're in. But I guess the thing about honeyeaters is, you know, as the name suggests, they're really reliant on nectar that comes out of the plants that occur in the Australian landscape. So they can be found across the whole country, from wet temperate forests to tropical rainforest to woodlands, and then, you know, really arid deserts when trees like and shrubs like eremophilas flower. You get eruptions of smaller nomadic honeyeaters like black honeyeaters and pied honeyeaters. So ecologically, they're really fascinating the way they are all tied to the different plants and different habitats of the country. As a group of birds, if you're a birder, they're fantastic to watch. They've got this really wonderful, collectively, they've got a really wonderful kind of behavior. This resource that they get onto at times is scarce. That might be eruptive behavior, and suddenly you get these big squabbles, interspecific flocks. It can be really rewarding birding and just fascinating ecology behind the whole group.
And so what size are we talking about? Is there a sort of difference in size range, and roughly how many species?
Yeah, so in Australia, I think there's 70 odd species, and they can range from really small things like black and scarlet honeyeaters. I'm trying to think of your audience. If you think of something that's probably half the size of a sparrow, some of them are really tiny, kind of flower pecker sized birds, right up to, in Australia, our biggest honeyeater is the yellow wattlebird, which is endemic to Tasmania. That's a raven sized bird almost. They're big. So there's a really vast range of sizes in the guild, and as I said, the size of the bird and the bill and the way they operate is all linked really tightly to the evolution of the flowering plants in the country.
Yeah, it sounds like Darwin could have come and looked at them rather than the finches.
I reckon he would have had a fascinating study. Yeah, I've thought a few times over the years, if he'd picked up on something like that, that seminal work would have been very different looking, I think.
Yeah, too right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the sort of region, which is the one we're here to talk about.
Yep.
First of all, give us obviously got a picture sort of not behind me. I'm not going to make that mistake of looking behind me. There's a picture. Roughly what size is that? Is it sort of, is it sort of thrush size, or is it,
Yeah, probably starlings, a small bit smaller than a starling. So, because they're so rare, I'm the national, as well as my role managing our Woodland Bird Program, I'm also the National Recovery Coordinator for Regent Honeyeaters. So a big part of our job is collating records that are made by community members and birders And the tough part of the job is interrogating people on, are you sure you've seen a Regent Honeyeater? That's a really crucial thing, because there are other species that particularly novice people or community members can mistake them for. And that's one of the things I always ask is, what size do you think the bird is? Are you talking about something that's a starling? Because of course starlings are introduced here and quite common through the range where Regent Honeyeaters occur. Yeah, so it's not, I don't think they're quite as big as a starling, but it's that sort of size. Right. So yeah, they're quite a sizable bird for a honeyeater.
Right. And before we come on to numbers, what's the distribution of the regents over in Australia?
Yeah, so historically they occurred from South Australia around Adelaide through, if you think of the Great Dividing Range in Australia, that big mountain range that we call mountains, not quite Alps size, but up the eastern seaboard of Australia. Historically, they kind of hugged either side of that mountain range up to about Brisbane, southern Queensland. These days, we consider them extinct in South Australia, and certainly Western Victoria. We'll get one or two records maybe per decade these days, but they're pretty much gone from there too. So it's sort of central and northeast Victoria through New South Wales along that eastern seaboard and up into southern Queensland. So, the range hasn't changed enormously apart from that Adelaide and Western Victoria drop-off. But the population is what has really plummeted since Europeans have arrived in Australia.
Right, and what are they classed as in the red list?
They're critically endangered. So population-wise, we think that that we've done a bit of work in the last couple of years. We think the population may be as low as 200 birds, or that's kind of the 200 mature individuals is what we think is the mid-ground estimate. It may be lower than that. It may be as high as 400. But the fact that they occur over such a large geographic area does make it a challenge. It's not like island conservation where you get a neat, a couple of 100-hectare reserve on an island and that's where your thing is. This species can occur basically between Melbourne and Brisbane. And we think there may be as few as 200. So, and they move around. We'll touch on that in a minute, but they are a challenge to try and work on, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, you actually just mentioned something that I want to touch on next, which is, what is their movement? Are they presumably the residents? What is their movement within Australia?
I mean, I guess the key thing is that they're endemic to Australia, so they occur nowhere else. They are what we call, this really fancy scientific term, they're a rich patch nomad. So over the last 25 years of work through the recovery team, we're starting to get a handle on where they occur, but there's still lots of knowledge gaps. There's still times of the year where they vanish on us and we don't know where they are. But as a general rule, they do move around their range, not as a whole unit, but you'll have, clusters or flocks of birds turn up in response to the flowering of key trees that they feed on. So, there's probably 8 or 10 eucalyptus species that they are heavily reliant on in their range. If one of those flowers really well in central New South Wales in the Capity Valley, which is one of their key spots, you'll have a lot of them there in spring. And when I say a lot, in contemporary terms, that might be 50 birds. But as the flowering and the nectar flow drops off, then they'll disperse out into other parts of the landscape. And the following season, the Hunter Valley or the Greater Sydney Basin might have some good flowering. Other parts of the range, there'll be pockets of flowering and the birds move into those regions. So yeah, they're not the sort of thing that you could say, right, we're going here and we're going to find a Regent Honeyeater. It is still very dependent on the time of year and what's flowering and providing nectar.
Right, okay. And you mentioned that sometimes of the year they disappear and you don't know where they go, which I want to come on to in a sec, because I was going to talk to you about habitat, but you've pretty much covered habitat there in what you said, but you did mention Lower Hunter Valley, and I want to pick up just quickly on that. Lower Hunter Valley, first of all, how key is that to the region? But secondly, you've just had quite a significant campaign around trying to protect that. So what's the outcome of that?
So we consider these days, the National Recovery Plan has 4 key regions identified. One is the Kapiti Valley, which is, if you think of Australia in the location of Sydney, if you jumped over the other side of the Blue Mountains National Park and go slightly north, you'd land in the Kapiti Valley. So that's arguably the most important place for the species, and then more broadly that region north and east of there. Then we have the Lower Hunter Valley, which is increasingly being used these days, probably more than we may have realised previously. Then you head into northern New South Wales, up around Armidale, a town in northern New South Wales. The woodland to the west and north of there is still important. And then in northeast Victoria, around Chiltern Mount Pilot National Park, some really great mugger ironbark, box ironbark habitat. So they're kind of the key regions. And then, there's subsidiary areas of those that we consider important. But yeah, increasingly the Lower Hunter Valley, we think, particularly over the last decade, Australia has suffered through pretty bad drought conditions as the decade's gone on, which obviously culminated in those horrendous fires about 12 months ago. It appears that coastal patch within the Lower Hunter Valley is going to be a really important coastal refuge with a bit more rainfall, with a more favourable geographic location. The flaring's a bit more reliable. When the drought hits, it doesn't seem to be as hardly impacted as inland areas. But as fate would have it with almost every conservation story, one of the most important pieces of land in that region is owned by a developer who wants to do all sorts of wonderful things with that habitat. And it's an ongoing story that's been going for probably the best part of 2 decades now. And it's kind of moved through a couple of sets of hands. Really, it's still an ongoing issue. So, this is a site where a couple of years ago, we know birds bred. We know 15 years ago, we had a really good breeding event in this area. And that year, it was pretty much the only spot that the birds bred in their whole range. So, it is critically important that this site gets protected. But yeah, we're up against it. I mean, the legislation and the impositions for any sort of development there mean that, that they'd have to jump through a lot of hoops to do anything. But while it's in private ownership and it's, still kind of flagged for development, the danger is there really that we could or lose or have seriously impacted, a really key site for the persistence of this bird.
Yeah, and I'm sure I read that it's a key biodiversity area. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. So there's quite a few KBAs in Australia that are designated because of the persistence of Regent Honeyeaters in those areas, and the Lower Hunter Valley was one of those, particularly that area. So it is recognition of just how endangered the bird is, and how valuable these sites are if we're going to save them.
And how much protection does that give particular sites that they are key biodiversity areas? You'd think that, well, if it's called a key biodiversity area, then that would be sacrosanct, that that's it, that's what it is, and you're not touching it. Is that the case? Because it doesn't sound like it if they're still sort of for years of looking to develop it. So how much protection does that give it?
Look, there are high levels of protection within Australian legislation. So if something is a conservation covenant on private property, that's a designation put on the title of the private land. I like to, the analogy is almost like having national park on private property. So that's, one of the more serious and permanent protections you can put on private land. Within the public land space, probably national park would be, the highest level of protection, though they're you know, within national parks, there's still scope for recreation to occur and so on. You know, then you have, you know, conservation reserves and conservation areas and state parks. And, you know, as you sort of go down the levels, you can, you know, some state forests and state parks are subject to logging and so on. So KBAs are used increasingly in planning processes. And I know, you know, some of my friends work in government or local government, state government. You know, they look at those designations, but you know, there's still the ability at times for, you know, inappropriate activity to take place in those regions. Yeah, there's better protections that can occur for those areas. So whilst this place is in private property, even though it sits within a broadly defined KBA, yeah, it can still be developed.
Right, and just before we leave that, what developments is the threat? You know, what are they looking at? Is it logging? Is it, you know?
No, so
park, you know, what is it?
That place in the lower Tamalpin woodlands in the lower Hunter Valley, I guess if you go back a couple of decades, Newcastle, which is about 45 minutes away, was a very blue collar town with a big steelworks, and the steelworks was shut, and this region in the lower Hunter Valley was slated as, it's called the Hunter Economic Zone, and the notion was that we'll put industry and small businesses in this area, and, you know, we'll translocate people's jobs. So all the people that are losing work at the steel mill and the steelworks can go and get jobs at this place. As that was happening, the global financial crisis hit, and the original landholder went into receivership. It's now gone into other hands, and, you know, they've muted a coal-fired power plant a couple of years ago. Was one that was floated through the media. The latest discussion has been around a bank of batteries within that site as part of Australia's, you know, push to renewables. So, you know, it's important to say BirdLife's not anti-development. We are all for, you know, green power and switching to better alternatives, but, you know, there have to be sites that are more appropriate than, you know, the middle of a critical spot for, you know, Regent Honeyeaters.
Yeah, and I think that's an important message, you know, and sometimes maybe a little bit misunderstood. You know, conservation organisations and conservationists, amateur naturalists, whatever, you know, we're not against development, and certainly not against green development, but it's right place, you know, right time, and taking into consideration the habitat. So yeah, I'm glad you said that. That's actually quite key. Which brings us to you. So it brings us to BirdLife Australia. You mentioned numbers earlier on birds. So what are you doing, BirdLife Australia, in order to protect the Regent Honeyeater?
Yeah, this could be quite a long answer. So I'll try. Yeah, I guess the important point to start with is this is a bird that 200 years ago was in flocks of thousands. So John Gould, who arrived and, you know, did all those amazing illustrations from this part of the world, he had them breeding outside his hotel window in the middle of Adelaide. This is a bird that in the literature is described as occurring in thousands in some seasons in locations. One place in the lower Hunter in the late 1800s or early 1900s, I forget now, you know, it's described through a winter as you couldn't hear any other bird calling in this forest. All you could hear was Regent Honeyeaters. Like literally thousands. The normal was for them to be in flocks of thousands, and then we're now down to 200 to 400. So the game has changed a lot for this bird. The recovery team's been in effect for 25 years. One of the smart decisions they made early on, back when the species was just endangered, was to take a captive population in and start an insurance population, captive breeding population. But at the same time, we've pretty much worked tirelessly to try and address the threats in the wild. So there's extensive habitat restoration plantings that have been done in key sites. So literally, you know, over 1 million trees and shrubs have gone back into the ground in these key sites. For the last decade in particular, BirdLife's worked with a bunch of partner organisations like the Biodiversity Conservation Trust in New South Wales to try and secure conservation covenants on private property, on parcels of private land. You know, something like 50 or 60% of our records of Regent Honeyeaters occur on private property. So we can't leave it up to the reserve network. There has to be partnership with private landholders and farmers. We are, we band, colour band birds and track their movements through observations by us and community members and birders. We do lots of community engagement, trying to fly the flag for Regent Honeyeaters and their plight. One thing we've done a bit in the last couple of years is trying to control noisy miners around key breeding sites. So we have this really weird intermix where a bird conservation organisation is trying to work out how to control one common and overabundant native honeyeater to benefit a critically endangered native honeyeater. So we're doing some of that work. And look, there's other bits and pieces, but I guess the other main thing that we do is the captive breeding and release program, which is headed up by Taronga Zoo in Sydney and working with a host of other institutions around Eastern Australia.
Right. Okay. And I saw from the video on your YouTube channel, which again is worth anybody going and spending a few days on, because there's some really good videos on there, not just of the region, but of various shorebirds and all sorts of stuff.
Yep.
So I saw from that you released 50 birds, and you were talking about releasing more. Does that mean that they're quite an easy bird to breed in captivity?
Yeah, and they're a bit of an enigma, and this is something that as a recovery team we still scratch our head about a little bit, but we've started to get a handle on what's happening in the wild in the last few years. In captivity, it sounds really crude, and I don't mean it to be, but you can effectively turn them into battery hens, and not that we do, but it's not uncommon, particularly a decade ago as we were trying to build the program. You can double and triple clutch birds in captivity, so they can go down on a nest, they'll raise fledglings and they'll get them out of the nest, and if you take those fledglings and put them into a crashing aviary, they'll readily go and nest again, and they'll raise another clutch of birds, and you could take them out and they could nest successfully 3 times in one breeding season in captivity. Now, it's not sustainable to do that to your birds, as anyone who's kept birds would know that that will exhaust your birds eventually. Yeah. But the thing is, in a captive setting, as a general rule, they're pretty easy. Now that we've got the husbandry sorted, they're pretty easy to get a sustainable breeding population happening. So I guess we were scratching our head for a while trying to work out, how does that, I know captives is different, but there's no difficulties from them to breed in captivity. What's happening in the wild? And what we did a few years ago, while we were doing our captive releases, we had a PhD student from ZSL and from the UK come out and study what was happening in the immediate post-release period. At the same time, we had a fantastic PhD student at Australian National University looking at that same thing with wild birds. And what we found was the levels of predation at nests for Regent Honeyeaters was through the roof. So in the wild, they're really struggling with all of the stuff I mentioned, habitat loss and competition, all of that. And then we've worked out that when they nest, they're having their eggs and chicks taken by sugar gliders, brush-tailed possums, ravens, currawongs, kookaburras. They cop a bad weather event, they die. And in some ways you kind of think, well, it's amazing that they've persisted as long as they have when you start to see that, the challenges that they're up against. It's tough for them.
And what's the average brood size?
If we get 2 birds out of a nest, it's a good nest. So they can lay up to 3 eggs. I think very occasionally 4, but Yeah, usually, the average number of birds out of a nest off the top of my head is something like 1.6, 1.7 birds.
Right.
Yeah, generally, as a general rule, I think they'll lay 3. Yeah, hatch and fledge 2 is a good nest. We had a good, I won't say we had a good season, but we had 4 triplet nests last year, which was a bit of an anomaly. We didn't have many nests we found, but yeah, of I think 8 nests, 4 of them produced 3 fledglings, which was really encouraging. I guess the interesting thing is that a few of those are in areas where we've done control of noisy miners, and we're trying to implement some nest interventions as well. So, it hints that there's a bit of help, does help them with their breeding. But similarly, we've had birds produce triplets out of nests that we've not done anything to. They've just managed to pick the right spot. So, yeah.
Right, okay, before I move on to the next question, just for those watching that might not realise, a noisy miner is a bird, not a small child with a drum, or a man with a helmet on and a light on the front going underground a lot. Just so
Exactly.
So, what I wanted to come on to is, first of all, how many birds have you actually released to date?
Over the life of the recovery team, I think we are just about 300 and around about 320 birds in total so far.
Right.
So that's staggered. We've done that over that's over 7 captive releases, and we started small and built up over time. But last year we moved. That was largely in Victoria. We've now gone to trying to release birds into what we would call the core of their range in the Kapiti Valley and Greater Blue Mountains, Lower Hunter area. Yeah, so we did a release of 20 birds last year. But yeah, over the life of the program so far, say 20 years of doing captive releases, we're at 320 so far.
320. So really, without this program, there's a distinct possibility that these could be extinct already.
Potentially. I mean, it's really, with a species that occurs in such low numbers and densities these days, it's hard to get a really good handle on actual population size. I mean, what I could say reasonably confidently is that the vast majority of birds that get seen in Victoria these days are captive released birds or their offspring. So I think at the southern end of the range, we have helped maintain persistence in the wild. What we haven't had lots of evidence of is captive released birds occurring throughout the range, or really clear evidence of their offspring spreading throughout the range. So there's potential that it's happening, but that the jury's still out to a degree on the level to which the captive breeding program is maintaining them in the wild at the moment. But it kind of makes sense. We've got re-sightings data. We know they can, we're seeing them at least 4 to 5 years post-release in small numbers. So there is a level of persistence that occurs, but, trying to find 200 birds spread over, hundreds of thousands of hectares, it's a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've got a couple of questions about that. But first of all, with regards to the reintroduction, you talked about habitat management earlier on. Is there any other pockets of suitable habitat in Australia you could think, right, okay, well, there's a protected piece of habitat up in the northwest of Australia. We can try do a release program there. Is that viable?
I don't think so. I think, as a recovery team, we're probably beholden to trying to maintain persistence of the species within its natural area. As soon as you started to look at doing that in a completely new landscape, we still don't have a great handle on how they navigate their way around the landscape in response to those flowering events. So if you put them into a part of Australia where their natural cycles don't exist, we just don't know what would happen. And then you'd also be imposing a new species on another region where they haven't evolved. So I'm sure there's potential for flow-on impacts on other species in that region. I mean, we still try and, I mean, we do evaluate the success of each release. Did we get the site right? Were the conditions correct? Are there new sites we can go and look at? So these are things that are always on the agenda of the recovery team. It's part of the constant review that we do around our program to try and finesse it to improve the outcomes.
Right, okay. And earlier on, I sort of alluded to this, that you've got these birds and you don't know where they go. And, you've mentioned a couple of times there's a massive area they try and look at them for. Is there a sort of tagging project in place where you can actually try and map their movements?
So what we've done historically, as I mentioned earlier, is colour banding. So putting 3 colour bands and a metal service band on in combination, gets us lots of different identities. So we've been able to do that over the past couple of decades and get some point-to-point movement. So we know where it's banded, we know it gets re-seen. So that's helped us get a base understanding. We've done trials of radio tracking of wild birds, but the issue is, Regent Honeyeaters weigh somewhere between 35 and 45 grams. So by default, you're limited to a radio transmitter that at best probably lasts 10 or 12 weeks. So generally, while you're tracking them, it's in a breeding season and there's no migration happening and there's no movement happening. So you kind of track them around the good habitat, and then the transmitter stops working or it falls off or whatever. One thing we are looking at the moment, and kind of over my shoulder that way, I've got 10 satellite transmitters that we've just got our hands on. So we're just going through the process of refining the attachment technique, and we're going to do some aviary trials over the next couple of months at Taronga Zoo. But the plan this year is to start to try and deploy those. Notionally, they last 18 months to 2 years. And we're hopeful that we'll start to get a bit of a feel for where they go in that post-breeding period, because that's really what we don't know. We find them in their breeding locations because of the monitoring program we've got and the community members that find them. But from, I'll make a joke, from December to April some years, someone could offer me $1 million to find them a Regent Honeyeater and they'd keep their $1 million. They literally vanish on us. So for a critically endangered bird, there's kind of a third of the year where we don't really know where they are or what they're doing. We've got all sorts of weird and wonderful theories, but we want data. We want real hard data that tells us where they are. So hopefully that this year will be a starting point to unravel some of those mysteries.
Yeah, and is there a citizen science project sort of involved around this for asking people to track their records? I mean, it's difficult for somebody that lives in the UK because, there's very little places you can hide in the UK as a bird. Obviously in Australia it's vast.
Yep.
So some of the areas you're talking about, I don't know how sort of populated they are, how many birders actually get into those areas, but is there a citizen science project?
Yeah, so one of the big things we've done as a recovery team, and certainly BirdLife, I mean, one of our key goals is getting people involved in this work. So for the last 25 years, in conjunction, the Swift Parrot and the Regent Honeyeater recovery team have run national search weekends, one weekend in May and one weekend in August, where we try and get community members out in a coordinated sense to search suitable habitat for these birds. And that's been really valuable to find both species and, again, start to get some data on where they occur. But by default, you're probably going to sites that you already know may be used or are potentially used. The thing about the satellite transmitters is that we're hopefully going to find places that we may not even have ever considered that they go and use. But there is citizen science that does happen with the species, and it has been a really valuable part of the journey of the recovery program so far. And we also, as well as just bird observation, community members and volunteers are the driving force behind our habitat restoration plantings. Invariably, there's a local volunteer committee or a couple of paid staff that coordinate these restoration events, but it's 100 volunteers that turn up on a weekend to plant 3,000 plants You know, this work just does not happen without that input, and it still amazes me that we have so much commitment from people to do this. It's just awesome.
That's just it. I mean, you know, the passion is out there, you know, the will to help wildlife recover is out there, and we just need more of it, and we need a bit more of it in sort of maybe governmental areas, you know. It's
yeah. And I guess in Australia at the moment, there's quite a bit of funding for Regent Honeyeaters and a few other threatened species. So we're probably the envy of some programs at the moment because we have a bit of money available, and I'm really conscious of that. You know, that these efforts, they don't last forever, and particularly for a bird that's at 200, you know, left in the wild, it kind of feels like the last stand a bit at the moment. You know, you only really get one good chance to save this bird and turn it around. So we do all we can to make the dollars stretch, to make the decisions we're making as smartly as possible, and just get the buy-in, as much community involvement, engagement with all levels of government around the plight of the bird. And yeah, that's in some ways that's the easy bit. Actually saving the bird is really bloody hard.
I can imagine. Yeah. Right. Well, that was really a great insight into the sort of Regent Honeyeaters and the Honeyeaters as a whole, and the project. So thanks ever so much for that. And you know, I wish you all the luck in the world with it. You know, it's clearly, you know, you need some luck as well as the funding and the people. But yeah, it's, you know, it's a great project and a great bird, and hopefully, you know, through your work we'll see it bounce back significantly.
Fingers crossed. We hope so, for sure. Thanks very much, Alan.
Thanks for your time.
Cheers. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye now.
Bye.